you don't have to wait for 10 years to start to see those benefits.
That's right.
That as we start living differently, as using our language here at Faithful and True, we're living more out of that wise adult place, we do start to see the benefits early on. 10 years later, the investment has grown, but even in those early years, there are those shifts, those changes, our reactions, our responses. One of the phrases I often use with men that I work with is that's an indication your recovery is working. When you're able to ask for your need, when you're able to have a conversation in a new way, and when you ask for a do-over in something that you weren't pleased with how you handled the first time, those are things along the way early that you could
Hmm.
begin to see, oh, wow, my recovery is working because I am just showing up differently. Sometimes I'm showing up differently because I'm choosing it. And sometimes I'm showing up differently because this healing has occurred internally and it's just a natural now expression of who I am.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy E. Everett, your co-host, and we're happy to be here as usual with our host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, it's good to see you on the screen. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to be here.
Well, we have turned to Zoom for today's podcast because our special guest is Anthony Gonzalez. And Anthony is one of the newest members of the Faithful and True team. Anthony is going to be leading men's groups, and he's also going to be seeing individual men for counseling. So, Anthony, welcome. We're happy to have you with us, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Greg. As I was saying, I've been listening to the podcast for a long time, and now it feels like such a great honor to be a guest on the podcast. Thanks for having
Well,
me.
we are glad that you are here. And probably a great way to start is just for you to take some time to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, as Randy said, my name's Anthony Gonzalez. Most people call me Ant, like the bug. My wife and I, Brittany, we've been married for 11 years. We've got three adventurous kids. And I first came to Faithful and True to the Men's Journey Workshop 10 years ago and have been working my recovery since then. But over the more recent years, have been able to offer my story and the resources I've come across to help other guys along the journey. And so, yeah, just in the recent months, have been coming on board with the team here at Faithful and True, and glad to serve.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a great milestone. It is in June that it will be 10 years. And so, what we're going to be talking about, you can explain the term, but the ROI of recovery. And so, what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, the ROI of recovery. ROI is a common business term for those listening. Maybe you've heard of it. If you haven't, it simply means return on investment. In other words, when you make an expense towards something, you likely track what return you get for that expense. If it's a stock that you purchase, you watch how that stock may grow. And if you sell that stock at some point and it makes a profit, then that profit is considered your return on that investment. And likewise, I think keeping that principle in mind is helpful when someone is starting out recovery or even just continuing their recovery to not just count the cost, but to count the returns. And that can help motivate, inspire, and see the long-term results of the journey you've been on.
Well, and I think the idea of investment is so important. We regularly talk about that recovery is an investment, that you give yourself to it. And we often say at the men's workshop, the more that you give yourself to the workshop, the more you're going to get out of it. And there are those men who come and they are a little bit detached. They're not fully invested. They're not engaged fully in their community here. And what's true is they get less out of it.
Mm.
But for the men who show up and they are fully invested, they're open, they're transparent, they're engaging the community, their experience is going to be very different. So, beginning with understanding recovery as an investment, I think is a great place to start.
That's right. And I had to decide that even before I arrived at the workshop, because the reality for me is that I was a new youth pastor. I was a seminary student, new husband. My wife and I had our first child under 1 year old at the time. But I had been discovered for my sexual behaviors. And that discovery was a really painful experience. It created not only chaos for me, but for Brittany, for the leadership of the church to whom I disclosed. And um, we were referred to Faithful and True for me to attend the men's journey workshop through my therapist. And I remember at the time seeing the price of the workshop and feeling like this big kink in my throat, realizing like, how am I supposed to afford that? I'm at the risk of even losing my job with the income that I make. But Brittany and I, we had been saving up to buy a house. We had been living in church housing, and we wanted to make an investment in a home. And we came to a crossroads of decision, Greg, where we realized we could either buy a house and have a dysfunctional, dilapidated marriage, or invest and have a thriving marriage and maybe live in a shack for a while. And for us, the answer became obvious. We would rather have the thriving marriage. And so we decided to take our savings towards a down payment on a house and put it towards the workshop. And subsequently for Brittany's parallel journey, her women's journey workshop, our couples workshop, therapy, etc. So I say all that because once I sat in the seat at Eden Prairie at the Faithful and True Center, I already knew we had put a commitment financially into this. So I'm going to get as much as I can out of it because I'm not just here for free. I've made a sacrifice to make this a priority. So yeah, I was eager. I was taking notes. I was sitting at the front row at the edge of my seat, ready and willing to receive whatever God would have for me during those 3 days.
Well, one of the things you've alluded to that I think is so true is that every decision has a cost. So there is a cost to recovery. There is a cost financially, there's a cost in time and energy. What's also true, though, is there's a cost not to recover. If we choose to maintain what we have, one of the great sayings of AA is half measures availed us nothing. And many of us want kind of TJ Maxx recovery where we get the most for the minimum. And the reality is there is that sense that if I'm not willing to invest everything, then the return is just not going to be as great. And so for those men and women who are willing to say, I'm all in, I'm willing to pay the financial cost as well as the cost of time and energy, they're going to be the ones that have the most transformational experience.
Mm-hmm. And there's a dip that takes place when you first start recovery. For me, it was very disorienting. It was a lot of change. I was integrating new practices, and that was a little bit disruptive in my marriage because Brittany was used to survivor man Anthony or a child like Anthony. But now as I was becoming a wise man, I was setting healthier boundaries. And so for her, it was a little bit jarring, but she had her own journey too. And so as we made this investment, at first it felt like things were getting worse before they were getting better. And that can make someone kind of like, if to use a stock market analogy again, right? You purchase some stock, maybe the market goes down a little bit and you're like, man, maybe I should cut my losses at this point. But what we found is you lead through the dip, that even though you experience a little bit of a dip in the challenge and the chaos, eventually you still see the fruit as you hang in there. And that's what we saw as well. So we go all in, we endure the process, we trust the process. And what was also true for us is that on the other side, not only did we come out thriving and growing, but now I was better at my job. I was better at work and other areas of my life. So the returns were growing. And what was also cool is 2 years later, we were still able to save up and buy the house that we were hoping for. So we ended up getting it all at the end, but it took time.
Yeah. One thing I just want to normalize is I think it is fairly common for everyone that it gets worse before it gets better. And we don't put that in our brochures or on the website because that's not a very appealing marketing strategy. But it is true because using another image, and that is one of remodeling a house, before you can remodel and do something new, you have to deconstruct the old. And in the deconstructing the old, one of the principles I've learned from my HGTV is you never know what to expect. And so you start, bringing down the walls, you start making adjustments, you start changing things. And that's when you begin to discover, oh, wow, when this house was first built, it wasn't maybe done with the best materials or with the best craftsmen. And so now not only are we deconstructing, but as we deconstruct, we're starting to discover some of the challenges in the house itself. And I think for a lot of people in recovery, that's what happens for them too. They start this thinking, okay, this is just about stopping some sort of sexual behavior. But when they really start investing and digging into their own story, they start to see the complexity of, oh, wow, this is so much more than just stopping a behavior. This is about healing old wounds. And I'll be honest, for a lot of people, that's where they stop. Kind of like
Mm,
what you said, the risk becomes too much. They're seeing the value of their stock go down and they pull out of the market. And what
mhm.
we hear pretty consistently is if you stay in it, work the process, you go through this season, but you just have to have the courage to do it.
That's right. And if I'm gonna break down my house to the studs, I better have some good professionals by my side to help put it back together,
Mhm.
right? And so you get what you pay for. And so I have been in that situation coming from, I was born and raised in Miami. We did a house remodel and we just kind of hired the most affordable contractor. Well, it ended up not being the best qualified guy, and we ended up losing $50,000 by the end of the deal. Instead, we then brought in someone who was trained, qualified, insured, a professional. Granted, they cost more money, but in the long run, we ended up saving money. And eventually, we sold that house for 3 times what we bought it for. So we received a great return. So, borrowing that same illustration you use with flipping a home or renovations and recovery, if I'm going to be pulling the layers back of my life, I want to have some good qualified professionals who know what they're doing to help me rebuild things that are stable and able to withstand the pressures of life that come as you grow older and have a marriage and build a family and
Mhm.
etc.
Well, and using that same analogy, the professional knows what to expect. Beth and I live in an old home in Chicago. We live in a condo building. The building itself is 100 years old. And we do have a very qualified, skilled craftsman that has helped us do some projects. And one of the best things about him is he has done a lot of work around these 100-year-old buildings, so he knows what to expect. He's not surprised by anything. Well, in the same way, if you have those professionals who aren't surprised by anything, they know what to look for behind the wall. They know what was being done 100 years ago when the building was being built, then they're able to navigate even some surprises in a more productive way. So I do think there's a value in having people on your team that have confidence in their capacity to navigate even the most complex situations.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So for me, 10 years down the road now, just to list some of the returns that I've seen in my own life, right? I've been able to identify, articulate, and ask for my legitimate needs. And that was a huge linchpin to my recovery because before I was acting out in attempts to meet my legitimate needs in illegitimate ways. But now, 10 years down the road, I'm not perfect at it, but I certainly have been able to build intimacy, rebuild trust with my wife, and I'm able to transfer these same tools and principles and skills into the lives of my kids. So I'm teaching
Mhm.
them how to become aware of their emotions, how to become aware of their needs, how to set healthy boundaries. Albeit when they apply those boundaries to me, sometimes I regret what I've taught them. But hey, I'd like for them to grow to be functional adults down the road. And so I'm seeing this return relationally. I'm seeing this return in my work with other guys. And it's a generational dividend that
Mhm.
will pay off because maybe what I've inherited was not something that was to be envied, but I'm building something that's creating a return, not just for me in my life, but for those who come after me.
One thing I also, for people who are listening to this, I want you to hear you don't have to wait for 10 years to start to see those benefits.
That's right.
That as we start living differently, as using our language here at Faithful and True, we're living more out of that wise adult place, we do start to see the benefits early on. And using that investment imagery, 10 years later, the investment has grown. But even in those early years, there are those shifts, those changes, our reactions, our responses. One of the phrases I often use with men that I work with is that's an indication your recovery is working. When you're able to ask for your need, when you're able to have a conversation in a new way, and when you ask for a do-over in something that you weren't pleased with how you handled the first time. Those are things along the way early that you could
Mm-hmm.
begin to see, oh, wow, my recovery is working because I am just showing up differently. Sometimes I'm showing up differently because I'm choosing it, and sometimes I'm showing up differently because this healing has occurred internally, and it's just a natural now expression of who I am.
Hmm. Yeah, I'll give one quick example too. So, in investment, early in my recovery towards rebuilding trust in my marriage included practicing Thanos, which we share a lot of Faithful and True as a check in between a husband and a wife. And so that was me disclosing honesty and vulnerability that would build trust. And that's an investment I made. Well, in return, I would hear my wife also share with me, and that built intimacy between one another. So that was a return on my investment that would come pretty quickly. But what's also true with investments in general is you can reinvest the returns you receive, right? So if my stocks are growing, I can continue to invest those dividends to see that multiply and grow.
Mhm.
Well, the same is true emotionally and relationally. I can keep reinvesting in that relationship. So you'll see those returns early on, but then imagine that being multiplied over the course of 10 years. It's like having interest working for you versus
Right.
against you. And so that's my hope, is that as you see the small incremental returns early in recovery, keep investing, and you'll see those returns continue to grow. And then you'll start counting things by decades instead of by
Yeah.
months.
Well, and you kind of alluded to this, but early on, when there has been betrayal, one of the things that is lost is trust. And one of the questions that we get many times from spouses is that question of, can you trust again? Or is trust even possible? And in the early days, it feels like the little trust that is there does not amount to much. Um, but it's just the simplest trust over time, as you've said, and you continue to reinvest that trust, then in time, there's a significant level of trust again.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this need for patience. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not even going to happen quickly, but there can be this cumulative effect. And I often say to men, you can never get somebody to trust you. You can only be trustworthy. And
Mm-hmm.
so, as a man chooses to be trustworthy, it may not feel like it's making any difference initially, but over time, as the wife is experiencing him as trustworthy, then the investment of trust begins to grow significantly.
And just as the market has its peaks and valleys, you might be making all the right investments, and circumstances may change. That may feel
Mhm.
like you're in a dip, but it doesn't mean you abandon ship. It means you just keep reinvesting and continue to be the trustworthy man that you're committed to be, and you'll work your way out the dip. So.
Yeah, well, okay. It's funny that I'm talking about the stock market because I really know so little about it. But what I do know is there can be external circumstances that impact the markets. And so the markets have a significant dive. And that can happen in our recovery also. There can be these circumstances. There can be a loss of sobriety. There can be a breach of trust. There can be a season of deception that is exposed. And then what happens is it feels as if that investment, all that investment that we made, was immediately lost overnight.
Mm,
And that can be true. But what I also want people to hear is even if that's the situation, over time, the market can come back if you continue to stay the journey. And especially early on, it's a volatile market. That's just what is true for us. And so it does take time for there to be a recovery when something happens and there's a dive in the market.
mm. Just a text that comes to mind in Jesus' teaching. It's a familiar one, but Matthew 6:21 says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And this text really stuck with me through a lot of recovery, because I realized if I'm willing to make the financial investment and the time investment and the relational and emotional investment, it it's like there's a direct nerve between my wallet and my heart, right?
Mhm.
And so if I'm willing to make the investments, it also shows where my values are, where my priorities are. But I guess the good news in all of this is that as we make these investments, there is a return. And at least from my experience over the last 10 years, it has been well worth every dollar invested towards great quality help in the recovery journey.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And one of the things that may be true is early on, like you said, there will need to be sacrifices. I've often heard the people here at Faithful and True talk about how when they first began recovery, vacations were delayed. Any money that they maybe were putting towards a new house or remodeling went towards recovery. I've never added up all of the money that I've spent on my own recovery, whether it's workshops that I've gone to or counseling that I've done. But I'm confident if I were to see that amount, it would be surprising how high it is, but there's not a penny that I've spent that I wouldn't say it was worth it. And I think that's part of the key is if we get caught up in the amount that we've spent, but we don't see the benefit that we've experienced, it can be disorienting. Beth and I have these moments where when our son got married and we were together at that wedding, when we go on a trip together and enjoy being with each other. We just had a grandchild born. The fact that we were able to experience that together, there's literally not an amount of money that would be too much for that to occur. And in the early days of our recovery, when our life exploded because of what I had done, our future wasn't promised. In
Mm.
fact, I did not believe there was a future for Greg and Beth. In fact, I thought the marriage was over. So 20 years later, we are experiencing these amazing dividends that did come from a significant financial investment. And we were fortunate. We had family members that were willing to see the value of this and also provide the resources to make this happen. So it can be taxing literally, but the benefit can be significant. And if you're going to give the money towards recovery, be a good steward of it. Kind of like what you said about the workshop. Bring everything you can to it. Get everything you can out of it. I had the opportunity to go to an intensive, and the recommendation that I was given to you is there's a lot of optional programs. Go to every one of them.
Hmm.
And so that's what I did. It may have been said, oh, this is optional, but if they were offering something, I wanted to be there to get everything I can. And so that mindset of eagerness, anticipation, excitement, hope, and also a willing to not just invest with money, but to fully invest with ourselves.
That's spot on. I thought about how the um, recovery is not a liability, it is an asset. The addiction is a liability.
Mhm.
But as we invest in the recovery, that's an asset that grows. And so I think that mindset of instead of expenses or cost mentality, it's an investment in asset mentality, and I think that will serve a lot of our men well.
And what's true is there may be some people listening, and genuinely they are in a difficult place financially.
Yes.
Part of their story may be that they lost their job, and they just don't have the resources, or maybe part of the way their addiction showed up was an inability to function well professionally, and they just don't have resources, or maybe they chose to spend their money on their addiction and don't have savings. One of the things I want people to hear is there are resources out there that are available that you can steward as you're saving up for those bigger things. So these podcasts and other organizations have podcasts that are free. There are workbooks that are less expensive that you can use in your recovery. There are groups, both online but also in person. There's a minimal cost or there's no cost. But again, it's that eagerness of whatever is there for me, I'm going to get it. I'm going to get something from it. And so if someone is sitting there going, well, I don't have any money for recovery, I would encourage them to kind of look at their resources and see what might be available. But even if there's not much, there's still a possibility to choose recovery in a very intentional and diligent way.
And on that note, there are so many others who believe in the value of recovery that they may be willing to invest in your recovery.
Hmm.
So there are ways out there to look up scholarship opportunities, foundations who would be willing to help invest to help you move out of crisis so that you get the help that you need, even if you may not be able to afford that level of care right away.
Right. And even this idea of I cannot expect people to know my need. And so I have to have the courage to ask for what I need. And so maybe I let family members know, hey, this is going on in my life. there's this workshop that I want to go to. Would you be willing to contribute to it? Or, be creative and say, I want my Christmas gift this year to go to this workshop. And it's going to take a vulnerability to share with the people around you. And you kind of mentioned scholarship. Sometimes we can go, if we're a part of a church community, and say, would the church be willing to help me with this or loan me and I'll pay back? But allowing that eagerness, that creativity to maybe overcome some obstacles. So I don't want to minimize financial challenges. Beth and I, when I lost my job and was fired, we were experiencing some pretty significant financial challenges. And if it wasn't for support of family members, that I wouldn't have had the resources that I had. So I don't want to minimize that. I just want to challenge people. Don't let that first no keep you from pursuing a yes.
Well, Ant, we want to thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. The interaction between you and Greg talking about these various details are sure to inspire a lot of men who are out there. I also wanted to interject the fact that as you're talking about, uh, don't get the impression that it's the cost of a house to come to the men's 3-day intensive workshop. If you take the time to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, click on the workshops, click on the Men's Journey workshop, and you'll see all the details involved and the cost involved. The registration fee itself is $1,400. Okay. And then you'll also have your travel and hotel expenses and your meals. That does add up, just as you were, saying earlier, but it's not the cost of a house. It's going to be something that's going to pay great rewards and great dividends to you down the line. So if you're hearing this and want to look closer at what it'll take to attend one of our 3-day workshops, visit faithfulandtrue.com and click on the workshops and find out the many details that we have available to you. We also have the information about the the women's workshops, which we do about 3 times a year, which has been very, very beneficial to the wives. And then we also have 2 different formats of the couples workshops. So visit faithfulandtrue.com. We've got over 550 podcasts like this one that are free and hopefully very, very helpful to you. So until we join you again next week, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.